Okay, let's continue to chapter 6 now, which is nicely titled Resilience from Panaceian to Pragmatic. We have already consternated over the different definitions of resilience, but the fact remains that our world is uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and dynamic. So, uncertain and ambiguous are slightly different. Our challenges are constantly changing at seemingly ever increasing speed, demanding greater forethought and flexibility than ever before in human history. Static protective and preserving measures are no longer feasible, if ever, as both human environment systems and their sustainability challenges are continuously transforming themselves. It's here that resilience comes in as a means for safety and sustainability. So resilience again is not just about bringing the system back to the pre-perturbation state of functioning, but to also keep moving towards sustainability in a safe manner. The term resilience is not in any way a new term. It is much older than commonly believed and neither originally invented by engineers to describe the performance of springs and other objects they bend, stretch and compress, nor by ecologists to describe stability and complexity of ecosystems. In fact, the term resilience was used as early as a few centuries AD and found its way into scientific English at least as early as the first decades of the 17th century, when Sir Francis Bacon used the concept to describe the strength of echoes. Well, amazing, right? So here we are with the number of publications per year between 1950 and 2013 in the bibliographical database Scopus mentioning resilience in title, abstract or as keywords. And it's a fair super exponential jump since about 2000, let's say. This is a bit of a bandwagon effect as well. As soon as one publication appears, let's say in a high impact journal like Nature or Science, then everybody starts noticing the concept and starts writing about it. Works for any particular thing, circular economy, aerosols, extreme events and so on and so forth. So this does indicate though that more and more people are paying attention to resilience in one context or the other, mostly related to climate change, but many will be related to societal resilience as well. So let's look at inherent restrictions for measuring resilience. This is key. We must quickly get to measuring things so that you know that you are moving ahead on the trajectory that you want to be on for sustainable development as the preferred scenario. Chapter 5 defines the resilience as capacity of a human environment system to continuously develop along a preferred expected trajectory while remaining within human and environmental boundaries. It continues by specifying that such resilience is an emergent property determined by the ability of the human environment system to anticipate, recognize, adapt to, and learn from variations, changes, disturbances, disruptions, and disasters that may cause harm to what human beings value. We're reading this again from last chapter, but it's totally worth reading again. This approach to resilience is, in other words, relative and context dependent, just as the concepts of development and risk. So everything is flexible and evolving. It is therefore impossible to compare the resilience of different human environment systems without setting the same preferences and defining the same variables for measuring deviations from these preferences. Monitoring, evaluation, ensuring progress requires that we have variables defined and measured. This may be straightforward, such as not tolerating any deaths in diarrheal diseases and looking at mortality statistics. However, it's most often more complicated in the context of sustainable development when there are multiple values to include and multiple risks to consider. Moreover, it's equally difficult to compare the resilience of one system over time, as the preferred expected development trajectory is likely to change from the first instance to the other. Again, the only way to compare the resilience of a system over time is to compare the same variables and to keep the preferences constant, artificially or not. Otherwise, you are likely to compare two different kinds of apples without even knowing it. So it's not apples and oranges, but you are just changing the apple species, let's say. Okay, you can think of many names, right? There are many types of apples that you can read up about. So let's look at a figure here comparing apples and pears. So there are apples that look very similar. In the middle you have thrown in an apple. So apples and oranges has been made apples and pears. So this may be disappointing for policymakers and practitioners who would prefer a set of straightforward indicators to measure. The more vague you sound, more uncertain you sound, more ambiguous you sound, the easier it is for policymakers and practitioners to just ignore you. That's not what you want. However, for the concept of resilience to have any meaning in relation to the sustainability of society, it must be able to capture the normative and context-dependent qualities of the concepts of sustainable development and risk. In other words, any attempt to devise an objective and universal measurement of resilience is destined to fail as long as the concept of resilience is defined in relation to our continuously transforming world. Okay, so just remember that. So you have to be pragmatic in that sense. That's what the chapter title is all about. It's important to remember that all knowledge of the world is socially constructed in context, and that human environment systems that I refer to throughout the book are models we construct to attempt to make sense of an overwhelmingly intricate reality. As soon as any endeavor to explain, understand, or improve something includes more than one person, power takes center stage as it determines who are allowed to be involved, to contribute, to decide, etc. Hence, power influences what is included and what is excluded in the human environment system in the first place, in the sense of vital boundary judgments introduced in chapter 5, Human Development Index and Environmental Footprint. It's also influencing the definition of the preferred expected development trajectory of such system, as well as what risk scenarios that are deemed relevant, what options that are available to maintain the preferred trajectory, etc. So this is discussed in many contexts that we'll come back to. Resilience is not absolute and objective. It's not objective. That's something very critical. It's subjective, but you still have to have collective action and carry all vulnerable people forward, be just and equitable. So it's relative and contextual. Although this approach is not radical or unexpected, it's vital to make the resulting restrictions very clear for all the various actors getting increasingly interested in measuring resilience of communities and society. Regardless of these inherent restrictions, it's still possible to identify and assess resilience by operationalizing the concept to guide what to look for in context. Okay, so sustainable development is still the ultimate goal. Pathways are there with deviations. Resilience is a big part to ensure that we steadily move towards sustainable development and get over disasters, perturbations, etc., social or natural, human environment system. But resilience is always contextual, so you have to keep that in mind as you keep tracking resilience, to make sure you are still headed to sustainability in this complex world. So just kind of try to carry the related concepts forward, and why it's important to make sure that we properly understand it and define it and figure out ways to measure it, evaluate it, and ensure progress. So I can't keep saying that enough, because measurements, indicators are always critical. Otherwise it becomes very descriptive, narrative, and sometimes in social sciences the problems themselves are very descriptive, and the solutions can also be very descriptive, sometimes discursive. But unless you have metrics to show that there is actual possible evaluation and monitoring possible to ensure progress, it can become just a report that cannot be replicated. Or if you want to fund something and you want to renew the funding after a few years, how do you measure progress to see that whether the funding should continue or not? It cannot be just descriptive. It can be based on surveys, but still the surveys have to quantify the impacts. So measure doesn't mean necessarily an instrument, the physical instrument, but has to be about a quantifiable measure. Okay, let's leave it here.